Welcome in to another episode of Your Drone Questions Answered, brought to you by Drone Launch Academy. I'm your host, Chris Breedlove. So today's question is this: what type of compliance do I need to worry about for the drone I'm purchasing or considering to purchase? Another way to phrase the question is, what's the difference in American-made drone versus NDAA compliant drone versus a Department of Defense DIU Blue listed drone? And now to add to the mix, there's a green list from AUVSI. So how to make heads and tails of these different lists, different standards of compliance. This is obviously becoming a greater and greater issue as we're chatting here in early 2025. We've seen multiple versions of the National Defense Authorization Act, that NDAA acronym, including the one for fiscal year 2025 that we're not going to talk about too much in this episode, but that obviously has some foreboding ramifications for the use of DJI for all users, maybe to come by the end of this calendar year. So pushing that to the side, again, the question remains for any drone buyer, prospective drone buyer out there, or possibly an existing UAS program manager at a large company. Okay, well, what tiers of compliance do I really need to achieve with my purchase? So to me, I kind of think of it maybe in four broad buckets. And before I go there, I should point out this is really a United States based discussion. Other countries, I'm sure, may or may not have some different frameworks. Probably some US allies maybe have very similar frameworks, maybe not. But we definitely have had this obviously ongoing. As anyone who's been on drones for more than 5 minutes probably has come to understand. It's getting a little tenuous here as far as folks' ability in the United States to use the drone tool that they think is best for the job. And again, not here to litigate that or argue that. I hope to have some guests on. I think we will in the future weeks and months to come to kind of weigh in on some of those things. But for today, this is more from that pure perspective of okay, here I am evaluating all these different performance features. Maybe I'm doing mapping, maybe I'm doing inspection, maybe I'm doing photography, whatever. I keep hearing these buzzwords: NDA compliant, blue list, green list, whatever. So we're going to unpack that here pretty briefly in this solo episode, and hope that really helps folks as they're making their budgeting and purchase decisions over the rest of this year to kind of consider, okay, well, is this the appropriate tier for me? Will my investment be protected? And I should also point out, if you're in certain states, there's state level legislation, of course, it's popping up. So this is just a starting point framework that hopefully will help demystify some of this. So first, there would just be anything, right? DJI most notably, obviously coming from China. And I say obviously, if you're not familiar, this will make more sense as I move through these other three buckets 2, 3, and 4. But and there's not just DJI, of course, there's all kinds of other drones. And it's not just the drone, right? It's the components. It's the controller, the radio, those critical components as defined in the NDAA acts. And really, it's a couple different years that are relevant here. And it's really related to supply chain security. But as a starting point, if you're a hobbyist, if you're doing photography, if the clientele you are working for or intend to work for are not certainly a federal, state, or even local government agency, maybe not a utility, anything else that might seem to deal with what could be or is critical infrastructure, private clients, private sector clients, or just for fun as a hobbyist, more than likely buy whatever drone you want. It really shouldn't matter. Again, there's some other issues out there that we're not going to address in this episode related to product access. Can DJI and other Chinese-made drones like Altel and so on continue to flow in freely to the United States through our U.S. Customs and Border Patrol? That's a separate issue. But as far as can I use this tool, I'll be allowed to use this tool to fulfill certain contracts for certain clients or what have you. Again, private sector clients, or of course for fun, again, generally Wild West, do what you want, pick the tool of choice. Okay, that's easy. Kind of the next bucket maybe, which would be American-made drone, right? And again, some of the state level legislation, which we're not going to go into specifics in this episode, it's been touched on in the past, maybe tackle some of those more in the future. But if you live in a state that has some of those particular restrictions, most of those really don't typically apply to private citizens. But if they happen to, or maybe you're like, I want to take on some projects for my local state park service, whatever the case may be, you might want to pay attention to that. So an American-made drone, or really an allied country, could be Switzerland, could be Germany, whatever, will likely satisfy some of those types of requirements. Let me kind of move into the big boys of this, which would be that NDA compliance, blue list compliance, and green list. So really, I should frame this all as a five-tiered approach, if that makes sense. There's do whatever you want, including most notably drones from China. There's American-made drones. That's number 2. So number 3 would be NDAA compliance. Again, that's the National Defense Authorization Act that's passed every year. These are generally massive bills, right? Could be 1,000 or more pages with all kinds of provisions much of it not having anything to do with, drones, unmanned aerial systems. That being said, a few kind of key laws, or I should say key years of the NDAA Act have really kind of tightened up for the federal government specifically. And it's all around supply chain security, right? So those covered countries, you may have seen that on different content and blogs. Start off with just China. A few years later, it was revised to include Iran, North Korea, and Russia. And so this does not mean that to be NDAA compliant, you can have no components at all involving the drone or its kit and cameras and so on from those countries. But it does mean the very specifically called out, critically named critical components cannot be manufactured in those countries. So it really is a supply chain related standard. Now, the interesting thing about NDAA compliance is there's not, a list. There's not an agency or any other body designating, oh, that's NDAA compliant. It really is a self-certification done by all the manufacturers. What gets really interesting about that is, and honestly quite confusing, talking to folks in the industry and as someone who is a drone reseller to my customers, it's okay, well, NDAA compliant says who, right? Again, we mostly rely on it, and that's fine and that's good. I think it's honestly a nice thing. Manufacturers do their validation as they understand the law and they say, hey, we're NDAA compliant. Possibly they have airframe A, and then there's like an A1 version that's NDAA compliant because they switched out the radio or other components, whatever the case may be. The confusing part becomes sometimes the exact same components, and I'll pick on one without naming any names, and it's not a judgment statement or a value statement, but the Blue HearLink controllers that a lot of folks are familiar with, of course, company HearLink radio, some manufacturers consider that NDAA compliant today in late 2024, now 2025. Other manufacturers view that as not NDAA compliant, and they've integrated other components, for example, swapping out the radio for a Doodle Labs radio, for example. So the confusing part in all that is, well, wait a minute, if it's the same Blue HearLink RC, the same HearLink radio, is it or is it not NDAA compliant? And that gets down to interpretation. So anyway, I just bring that up as an example. I'm not really trying to litigate whether there's a right or wrong answer to that, but there are different interpretations. That gets really, really confusing. If you're sitting there, let's say if you're a surveyor, which is definitely a world I relate to a lot, the aerial mapping and surveying industry. Okay, I need a new medium lift quadcopter. I'm doing clients, or I'm working with clients who are the state of X, Y, or Z that I work in, or possibly Army Corps projects, whatever. Got to at least be NDAA compliant to be as versatile and as future-proof as possible. If not, one of the other standards we'll get to in a moment, Blue List or Green List. But, again, manufacturer X says, oh, NDAA compliance, great. Manufacturer Y says it's not. So it becomes a little bit difficult to navigate that. There's not really a way to resolve that question, minus, I suppose, if you're in a state or doing a lot of work with clients who really care, you may have to ask them. And back to that Blue HearLink example, the reason I first became aware of that from where I sit was a customer of mine said, hey, I'm doing a project, or I will be doing a project for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And they specifically call out that they do not recognize HearLink radios and the Blue HearLink controller as NDAA compliant, despite the fact that up to that moment, this I'm talking now early 2024, had kind of been the go-to NDAA compliant radio / RC for so many of our American-made drone manufacturers. So these things obviously change, they evolve, it's fluid, and that's the tough part about it. So this conversation, even this episode we're doing right now, will become stale possibly very quickly as the reinterpretation of these things continues to evolve. So that leads me to my last two buckets. There's the Blue List, there's the Green List. I'm too confused by the colors, just two different lists from two different bodies, really trying to achieve very similar things. So first, the Blue List, this is where that tier 4 I'm trying to get to. And the numbers I'm just making up, this has nothing to do with anything, just the order I'm choosing to attack it. So DIU Blue List. DIU stands for Defense Innovation Unit. That's a Department of Defense, DoD entity or body. And their real purpose is to not only certify, vet out NDAA compliance, which they do, that is a component of being on the Blue List, but they add to that a cybersecurity component. And to me, this makes really good sense for what the Blue List is really meant for, which is for the Department of Defense, for our military. I'll make sure they're using tools that not only, again, are not coming from these countries that the U.S. Senate has deemed, problematic. Makes perfect sense to me. Not here to argue that at all. And then also add to that cybersecurity component. So you'll hear that a blue listed drone, which oftentimes there's a non-blue listed version of the exact same drone from the same manufacturer, generally, of course, more affordable if it's not on the blue list because the components are often Chinese that get replaced out for the cyber secure ones. And so Anyway, getting on that list is a whole process, of course. DoD has to administer that. That's been a complaint in the industry, of course, for years. Well, when can I get on the blue list? I wasn't on blue 1.0, I was on blue 2.0, so on and so forth. So it has its limitations for sure, but the intended purpose of it, again, is for the military. So that leads me to the green list, and I'll come back to the blue list kind of back and forth. Now that's produced, or that list is crafted, vetted by AUVSI, or at least through a third-party set of reviewers that they organize, however the mechanics are. It doesn't really matter for this discussion, but they promote, produce, curate the list, right, with some partners. And so anyway, the green list has a very similar mission to the blue list, but obviously it's not administered by DoD. It's not specifically related to warfighting capabilities. And so it's interesting. I think it offers a lot of good potential for the industry. But as we sit in early 2025, if you look at the two lists, we'll put all the links to the blue list and the green list in the show notes for this episode. There are, of the few manufacturers who have an airframe on the green list, most did come from the blue list, not exclusively. But there's a whole bunch of other folks on the blue list today who are not on the green list. And so you ask yourself, well, what's the difference? And again, the difference is purpose behind the list. AUVSI is trying to step into the void. I think that's a good thing, personally, so that folks can achieve a level of seal of approval of compliance with some of this legislation to help folks who are especially not DoD, not the federal government at all, make these purchasing decisions, and also allow manufacturers to more nimbly and more often get added to the list. So there's certainly costs involved with both processes. They are both overlapping as well. And so the idea as well might be, hey, I'm going to get on the green list and pursue that certification. That might pave the way for me as a manufacturer to end up on the blue list later. So to recap, and I'll make one more caveat and we'll get out of this episode. Again, if you're a hobbyist, brand new to drones, just want to have fun, maybe you're doing some aerial photography, nothing at all related to government contracts, likely choose whatever tool you want. DJI, Autel, whatever else, from wherever. As long as you get your hands on it in the United States, you're probably going to be just fine. A-okay. That's just whatever you want, anything you want to use. Then there's American-made drones and or allied country drones, again, Switzerland, Germany, whatever, Japan, South Korea. Again, that's fine. That might help insulate you if you are making more of a commercial and enterprise purchase to help not get locked out of future projects or contracts based on your equipment of choice, your tool of choice. And then from there, again, the last three kind of the main terms for this discussion: NDAA compliance, mostly related to supply chain; DIU Blue List, again, produced by the Department of Defense, intended for warfighting. There's other drones on that list. I'm going to come back to that here in a moment. And that's been curated a few different generations or iterations, you could say. And we'll see kind of the future of that list and how comprehensive or not it may be. And again, the AUVSI Green List, very similar to the Blue List, not intended just for warfighting capabilities, administered by AUVSI and partners, and idea being to kind of vet similar criteria, but actually a few additional ones. You go to the website, you can kind of read through all that from AUVSI, but with the same goal of kind of a seal of approval for different drone OEMs, different drone manufacturers to say, hey, at least this particular airframe of mine, and even radios and controllers and everything else, these critical components, again, as defined in some of the older NDAA laws from certain years, well, we check those boxes. And then also some cybersecurity and some other factors. So again, more of a versatile list. But if you're sitting there making a purchase, it's like, wait, should I go something that's just on the green list or on the blue list, or and wait for them to be on both? And I think honestly, like a lot of things, it depends, which is not the best answer maybe, but it's just the reality sometimes. But you got to come back to, well, what kind of work do I want to do? And really, who am I doing that work for? If you work for a major utility or you aspire to do some work for a major utility, many of them have their own lists. And so, starting with NDA compliance at least, and optionally maybe green and or blue might be a good starting point, but that doesn't guarantee that particular utility or even federal agencies doesn't have to accept use of that particular drone just because it's on any of these lists or meets any of these criteria. So the last caveat I want to make when we get out of this episode is kind of the future of the blue list. This is not just rank punditry or speculation, but this may or may not happen. This is just kind of a rumor, and I've heard it from a couple of reliable sources, is this, and it makes logical sense to me. So here it is. The blue list, again, I keep kind of referencing multiple times, is created by DoD for DoD. Others out there, even certain, I think, state level laws and such, and other entities, utilities, et cetera, are referring to the blue list. Even civilian federal agencies referring to the blue list for their mission requirements as far as approved drones, and yet they may have nothing to do with warfighting, combat readiness, things of that nature. So the rumor, if you will, as I understand it, is that the Blue List is going to get cold, and airframes that don't specifically support an obvious, combat ready mission, which however that's defined, and there's probably a really logical way to define it, and there's probably some gray areas of like, wait a minute, what if we're managing a really large installation and mapping, and yet, so that could get convoluted really quick. Who's to say? But the forecasted update over the course of this year will be that maybe some of the drones on the Blue List today in February 2025, will roll off the Blue List. They'll probably find a home on the Green List because, again, very similar requirements are being vetted, but it's just a function of not being, strictly speaking, very straightforwardly tied to the warfighting mission. And again, as I understand it, that's so that DoD, and again, that DIU, Defense Innovation Unit, doesn't get maybe as bogged down in so many applications trying to vet out these things for drones that might be awesome tools and probably are in most or all cases, and yet may or may not have a direct tie-in either to any particular DoD application, or at least not broad enough that they see fit to do the validation and the testing. So again, more to come. My prediction would be that come towards the end of 2025, we will see green list will be a lot more populated. I think we're going to see that for sure. I think we'll see a lot greater understanding of the green list and maybe standards and different procurements. And again, if I wish to be a contractor for entity A, B, or C, especially like utilities, agencies, I suspect they'll start citing the green list standard a lot more often. But up to now, I think we've seen a lot of folks have been pretty reluctant to pursue that green list process because they're like, well, I'm already on the blue list. I need to do this again. And that's just been really, really confusing. So anyway, to put a pin in all this, again, as you evaluate what drone is right for you and or your business, just think about these different things. There's a whole spectrum, a whole gradient of compliance with US law and standards. A lot of this is fluid. States are adopting their own standards. It feels like left and right. A lot of those only apply to state agencies. So if you're not, public safety or Department of the Environment or whatever it may be, likely okay. But in other cases, we're seeing that trickle down to the private sector and even just private entities saying, hey, we refer back to this law. So the landscape is constantly evolving. Again, this content might become stale rather quickly as things continue to evolve, both from a policy and legislative perspective and just how the industry responds. But hope that helps. Please drop us a note in the comments how we can clarify this further, how you maybe interpret something. Oh, hey, I got this component and these sorts of things, and it was NDAA. And also, if you're in a different country, I'd be interested to know as well. Do other folks outside the United States have these similar kind of spectrums to work with? And as always, if you've got a question like us to answer on this podcast, please submit that in the Drone Launch Connect community or go to ydqa.io and submit your question there. Until next time, be safe and have a great week.